because international news is going through a tumultuous change at the moment. The way we provide international news is changing, and the model of how we report the world and learn about the world, which has been in place for more than 100 years, has really been swept away over the last decade. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the reasons behind that and what I think some of the future for international reporting and how we learn about the world, what some of the future trends might be. And I think this huge change in international reporting has really come about because of three factors, or there are three different influences driving this big change. Economics, technology, and a series of cultural changes, I suppose, which I call put under the heading of globalization. So I'm going to talk briefly about those three and then talk a little bit about some of the conclusions that emerge from that. So in terms of economics, really over the last 20 or 30 years, the economics of news have changed profoundly. And I suppose the obvious reasons are, firstly, that at the beginning of the 20th century, foreign news was really subsidized by owners who wanted prestige and influence and were prepared to subsidize the heavy costs of international reporting. But towards the end of the 20th century, a lot of those big proprietors and so on were bought out, and corporate stakeholders and shareholders gained control of news organizations and started to demand a return and a margin and a profit on those organizations. So they had to cut costs. And at the leading edge of all of that cost-cutting was international news, which of course is very expensive. So there was a corporate shareholder pressure to cut costs and to cut back on foreign bureau and all of those fixed infrastructure costs, which had been the basis of a lot of international reporting. And then at the same time as that, or towards the end of that, there came the need to invest in new platforms. So if you're in broadcasting, from the 1990s onwards, there was satellite television, 24-hour news, and broadcasters had to invest in that. If you're in newspapers, then by the end of the 90s and certainly into the 2000s, of course, there was the internet and mobile. So as well as having to cut back and shave costs, there was also the need to invest in these new platforms and new digital services, and that means that those organizations had to cut back even further. And of course, at the same time, the internet in particular was undermining the commercial model and the business model for news, because advertising was going away from print and away from television ads onto the internet, classified advertising for newspapers in particular. So you had all of these three pressures, particularly on newspapers, which were really undermining the economics which had held up this kind of big, expensive infrastructure of foreign reporting for so long. The need to deliver profit to corporate shareholders and to cut costs, the need to invest in new platforms and in digital in particular, and the undermining of the business model and the economics as advertising fled its traditional places off onto the web. And there were some consequences out of that. One of the things that happened there was that these subsidies, cross-subsidies, which had always existed, where the profits from the sports pages or the business pages had helped pay for the foreign reporting, those kind of cross-subsidies were exposed and could no longer hold true. And some organizations got caught in a sort of downward spiral as they would cut budgets. They'd be able, their quality of their coverage and the quality of their content would fall, and then their audiences would fall, and then they'd have to cut more costs, and you get into a downward spiral, and some organizations, of course, disappeared. One of the things that's happened through this process is, as I say, the middle has fallen out of news, and this is particular with the arrival of 24-hour news and the internet. There's now sort of two markets increasingly for news. There's up-to-the-minute breaking news, and I'm sure we all can associate with this with the way we live our lives. We want to know what's happened in the last moment, who's the fastest breaking news, where do I go for that? And then there's deep specialist news. The particular issues that you're interested in or affect your life, you want to know more about. And you can go onto the web or onto some specialist place, and probably, you might be prepared to pay for that deep niche specialist news. But the middle, the sort of foreign feature, if you like, that sustained foreign bureaus for many decades has fallen away. There just isn't a market in that. Neither newspapers or indeed broadcasters are able to sustain that kind of middle coverage because there isn't the consumer interest in it anymore. So that, again, is changing the basis on which people want to organize. So instead of having an expensive fixed bureau with an expat correspondent there on, allowances and all the rest of it, they either want instant breaking news or they want the specialist niche news, and actually holding that fixed cost is not the best way to provide it. So there are some new models of subsidy coming through around the economics, and particularly around business and financial services. If you are Reuters or Bloomberg or the Financial Times or the Wall Street Journal, of course you have financial expertise that big corporations and big corporate customers will pay for. Other kinds of organizations have to find their own specialism that they can charge a premium for, and we're starting to see some of that come through. So we're in the middle of this economic transition. The old economics is kind of falling away. The new economics is still in development. Technology, of course, we all know about the internet and experience the huge change that's made to all of our lives. It's not just about the internet, it's about other sorts of digital technology. So the tools of production, shooting, editing, producing, of course, that's also been transformed by digital technology, and the costs of foreign reporting have fallen. So you would think that was a good thing. But these other factors that I've talked about have meant that there's less out there, less resources out there, and the extra productivity, that the more that you can produce because of these cheaper technological costs, have actually gone in feeding a whole lot of new outlets. So you have satellite channels and hundreds of internet channels, and you have a shrinking base of foreign reporting, which is repeating the same news for more and more and more outlets. It's like an upside-down pyramid with a little tiny base of foreign reporting feeding ever more outlets and actually reporting the same news in different ways onto print, onto TV, onto the web, onto mobile, onto whatever else it may be, and by and large it's the same kind of stories and the same agenda, rather than that productivity enabling wider coverage. Of course, we have social media and citizen journalism that's arrived. Much more can be said, and I'm sure will be said over the next 2 days about it. I think it's a thoroughly good thing, but it's both a source for traditional journalism and also a threat, because it takes attention away from traditional media and traditional journalism. There's this shrinking of overall reporting and a greater reliance generally on agencies, and in fact most international news on the web actually comes from Reuters and the Associated Press now. As well as citizen journalism, it's not just kind of bloggers and people on Facebook and Twitter. Every organization is a media organization. So whether you are a corporate, whether you are an NGO, whether you are a government, you can have your own direct channel to the public. So the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, has its own YouTube channel. All sorts of NGOs effectively run their own news operations now. And if you're a traditional media organization, that poses a new pressure on you. You have to sort through all of that material, verify it, understand what matters. And that pressure and the need to invest in all of that, of course, also means that traditional news organizations are under more and more pressure in terms of the resources they can put out in the field. And this responsibility for first-hand eyewitness reporting, the responsibility to bear witness, is also coming under pressure because of that. On the other hand, there is new opportunities for collaboration and for partnership and for what's called networked journalism, where media organizations can tap into these social networks, tap into kind of more freelance operations, and absolutely diversify, if you like, their sources of information. So there are opportunities in this big change that's driven by technology as well. And then finally, in globalization, really because of every organization, every news organization now is effectively global. So I can read the New York Times, the Jerusalem Post, the Straits Times. I can look at any new media from anywhere in the world at my desktop now. So everything is global and international, and that means the old Western model of an expat correspondent based abroad reporting an alien place back to a domestic audience has basically been swept away, because that's no longer appropriate. It doesn't feel suitable for the kind of coverage that we have today. It doesn't really represent the interests of multicultural audiences. Again, like Samira, I come from Britain, where, for millions of people in Britain, news about Pakistan is home news, not foreign news. So all of these cultural changes are starting to influence the way that people think about reporting the news. And that means there are fewer and fewer expat correspondents, but more opportunities for local staff to report and local freelancers to report. And we're starting to see all news organisations recruit more locally and to use more local freelancers and so on to report international news. There are good things about that because local staff have an expertise and understand a context better than an expatriate staff and speak the language and have more sources and all of those things. The problem with it is that local staff are more prone to intimidation and victimization. 2 journalists a week, every week, regularly for the last 10 years on average have been killed doing their work, and most of those are local journalists reporting corruption or a crime or something like that. So there are real risks in terms of local journalists, and not just the risk of violence, but they are part of the story that they're reporting. So there are social pressures on them in terms of what they report and how they report, because they live there and it's their families that are involved in what they're reporting and so on as well. So that this move towards using more local staff has real benefits, but is also quite complex, and there are quite a lot of issues to be thought through. Not least that in the multicultural, globalized world, in the way I've been talking about, it's more important than ever that we have what are called cultural bridges, people that can bridge from one culture to another, who can explain one culture to another culture. And again, local staff may be less able to understand the needs of an audience the other side of the world and what they need to understand and how they think about things than an expatriate. So that's another issue in how this kind of shift of staffing and reporting is going. One of the things that's happening is you're getting a much more of a bottom-up agenda from this. So much rather than it being, international news for a long time has been dominated by top-down agendas, government agendas, sort of what's the latest summit, what are they discussing, it's all top-down. You start to see much more bottom-up issues coming through, and that again I think is a very healthy thing. So to round this up, what are some of the consequences of all of this? Well, I think there are a number of them. I mean, on the one hand, we've seen this relentless closure of major news bureaus around the world, but on the other hand, there's real investment in low-cost news gathering and in what's called parachute reporting, and people are very dismissive of parachute reporting. That's where a foreign correspondent just flies out, does the story, and comes back again. But that has enabled organizations to go on reporting the world where otherwise they might not be able to. It's where costs have come out of those fixed costs of bureau and gone into variable coverage costs, and it helps develop journalists and so on as well. So there are some good things about parachute reporting. These changes have meant there are fewer staff correspondents based abroad, but there are more opportunities for freelancers and for local staff. The arrival of 24/7 real-time news has soaked up a lot of effort and resources, but there are more channels for reporting the world and more places to report the world than there have ever been before. There's been a shrinking of professional foreign news gathering, but this explosion of other sources of news and information that's available, not all of them coming from media organizations, but nevertheless a huge explosion in the amount of information that's available out there. The commoditization of some kinds of foreign news, the middle is gone and it's all about breaking news and so on as well, but there's a new premium on breaking news and an in-depth analysis which some organizations are managing to turn into sustainable business models, which we all need. There's a blurring of the foreign and domestic agendas going on. Actually, if you think about climate change or global economics or security, these are home stories as well as foreign stories in many ways. But there are new global audiences as well seeking information in new ways. So the agendas, and the structures of how news organizations structure their coverage, pure geography may not be enough. It may have to be by theme and by genre, and there are new audiences looking for that kind of coverage and information relevant to their lives. There is, I think, we talk a lot about a crisis in Western journalism as organizations come under pressure and there are big cost pressures. But of course, that is very much a Western thing. And in the Middle East and in Asia, actually news and journalism is booming, and print is booming, and broadcast is booming. And it'll be interesting to see over a period of time how that plays out, because at the minute a lot of the editorial values that we take for granted about holding power to account and challenge and a certain kind of confrontational aspect to news actually aren't recognized in that way in Asia, for example, where they have very different kind of approach and very rather different news values, and it's about respect to authority and social harmony and things like that. So there is, a number of consequences to all of these changes, and I think just to sum up, basically, In the past, a foreign correspondent was likely to have been a kind of middle-class Western male working in a foreign bureau supported by local staff, probably didn't speak the language, probably numbered their sources in dozens, working to 1 or 2 deadlines a day for one outlet. In the future, a foreign correspondent is going to come from a much more diverse background. They've probably lived in the country they're reporting, they'll speak the language, they may well work at home rather than out of an office, and through social media they will count their sources in the hundreds, not the dozens, and they'll probably be reporting for multiple outlets on multiple platforms through the day, and probably in a lot more transparently and openly than was the case in the past. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Richard.